Welcome everyone. I'm Mike Vandenberg. I teach here at the law school. I know many of you. It almost feels like a family reunion to some extent. We've worked across lots of different lines over time. And I'm here with Jonathan Gilligan.
Hi, Jonathan Gilligan. I'm in Earth and Environmental Science and Civil and Environmental Engineering here. And one thing that's been really fun, and it's gratifying to see so many familiar faces here around, kind of 10 years and more of work that Mike and I have done engaging with people across so many disciplines to try to synthesize a sense of what's possible through engaging behavioral sciences with the engineering side on assessing greenhouse gas emissions.
And Jonathan and I have been going around the country trying to get people interested in the idea of a private sector wedge in our book. And so as a part of that, we have done, dozens of talks. We've never planned a single one of them. And so we didn't play the introduction here either. And we're going to be as spontaneous as we typically are in our books when we try to talk about the book. It's always worked out pretty well.
It has.
In our own view, at least. Who knows? Let me just let everyone in the audience know that we are live streaming this. And so, while you're on the mic, which you should be whenever you're speaking, just recognize that we've got an audience from all over and not just here in the room. And so let me just say a word or two about what we're trying to achieve with this workshop. And roughly a decade ago, a group of us really tried to, I think, put the behavioral approaches to climate change and energy on the map a little bit. And we wrote a paper that identified 17 different action types and argued that essentially non-regulatory interventions could achieve a behavioral wedge, a wedge of emissions reductions that would be 20% of the household sector within a decade. We're now a decade later. And what I want to show you is that our paper worked. So this is actually from a paper by Lucas Davis, and Jonathan's going to give us a corrective on this in just a moment. But if you notice, we published in 2009. Notice when household per capita electricity consumption levels off and starts going down. So, if we were politicians, we would just take the credit and walk away at this point. And I'm afraid when Jonathan gives you more little context on this, it'll perhaps change your perception a little bit about this. But in any event, that was our goal. And what did that look like? It looked like an effort to try to sift through the complex and uncertain data and concepts out there and pull together something that had a scientific credibility but was valuable for policymakers at the same time. And so what we tried to do is not just focus on what we now think of as behavioral plasticity, which has been studied at great length in many areas, but often in what I think of with an instinct for the capillaries. It often looks really carefully at a behavior that when you step back doesn't really matter that much. On the other hand, you get the concept of technical potential, the idea that if we changed all of a particular behavior, that doing so would really matter a lot. And the other thing I see in the literature over and over again are studies that say, hey, the only thing that really matters is this action or this group of actions because these actions have a very large potential to make a difference in overall greenhouse gas emissions. And yet often those actions are some of the hardest to change. And I think of carpooling as being one of the excellent examples, remarkably effective if people will do it, very hard to get people to do. And so I think an insight that we tried to push forward is to do both technical potential and behavioral plasticity. And let me say just one last thing as a lawyer. We'll have through the course of the day some lawyers on the program and some law students in the audience as well, is notice that our fourth column here is rare, reasonably achievable emissions reductions. For the lawyers in the audience who do environmental law, you know that we love acronyms. And we have a concept called LAIR, lowest achievable emissions reductions, and one after another of these best available technology standards. And we were consciously in this paper trying to come up with an assessment here, which is one that would resonate with policymakers. Because I think we tend to think of individual behavior in households as a sidelight to mainstream policy. But if we can use the language and approaches that we use when we're setting a policy for industrial and other sectors, I think we'll begin to get more traction in the policy world. So from my perspective, that's a step that we tried to accomplish in this paper.
Yeah, and so what we can see here is this kind of illustrates graphically the difference between just the technical potential, what kinds of emissions reductions could be achieved if everybody did inaction, which is what you see in the light blue, and then when we account for what are people reasonably expected to do with appropriate and achievable incentives, which is shown in the dark blue. And so we can see, first of all, it's important to be prioritizing things that have a big potential impact, but also things that people will actually do. So clearly, even if everybody adjusts the temperature at which they do their laundry, that's got a fairly small impact, even if you can get everyone to do it. On the other hand, carpools have potentially a very large impact, but it's very unlikely that we're going to quickly get a majority of people to participate in carpools. So it's really important to get that balance there. And we also want to keep up with adjusting our analysis as new technology becomes available. So if we look back here at Mike's success story, Lucas Davis ascribes most, or a very large part of this, to the adoption of energy-efficient light bulbs. But if you look at our table here, or our graph here, you'll notice that there aren't any energy-efficient light bulbs on there because, first of all, we just assumed, well, there was an energy efficiency law passed in 2007 that was going to get everybody to just switch over automatically to energy-efficient light bulbs. And then the LED light bulbs, which are super efficient, weren't really ready for market quite at that point. They came along later. And so with the shift over to compact fluorescent light bulbs, this happens. We see a big reduction in household electricity use, and I estimate this reduces emissions in the U.S. just from the lighting part of it by about 20 million metric tons a year of carbon dioxide. But when we dig into the details, there's still even more untapped potential from people who haven't shifted from incandescent bulbs to LED bulbs, which are now the new standard. And there's a great potential if we can start to engage more intelligently with the behavioral sciences to say, what would it take to get more people to switch over to LEDs, given that there's actually economically huge, they can get very big savings from that and help the environment. So there's big success, but there's a lot of room to keep going on this.
Right, and so just so as a lawyer, what I would say is, although we love to claim credit for this decline, the unfortunate thing is if Lucas Davis is right, all of this can be explained by Walmart and other retailers offering low-cost, acceptable LED light bulbs, which we excluded from our analysis at the last minute. And by the way, Jonathan's being really modest here. I was in favor of excluding it from the analysis. I think you were in favor of including it. I don't know, Tom and Paul and Jerry, where you guys were on that. But anyway, just give you a sense that there has been a real change here. I think this phenomenon is incredibly important because there's a sense of a lack of efficacy when it relates to households and individual behavior. I think this shows us you can actually change the household sector. I think implicit in the work that we did, if you look at the kinds of targeted behaviors, is the notion that the initiative feasibility or policy plasticity, which we'll talk a lot more as the day goes on about, that really matters. What we tried to do is pick behaviors where it was reasonably likely that either a policy had been adopted or could be adopted, or that we didn't need a government policy, that there might be some private action. So we were trying to account for, in an implicit way, I think, even though we didn't include it as one of our actual columns of analysis, I think behind this analysis was an assumption that we had to think about what was actually a viable policy response, whether that was a public government response or a private response. One other goal that we had, I think, is played out well through these two pie charts, and we put this into a follow-on paper. But essentially, we're trying to help people conceptualize just how important household and individual behavior really is. And this pie chart here is from a Commerce Department report that was then used by the U.S. Commerce Committee when it did the white papers that led into the Waxman-Markey legislation that passed the House and then died in the Senate. And as you can see, based on this, you really wouldn't focus on households very much. They were called residents, it was the residential sector, and they account for 5% of U.S. emissions in this analysis. right? And there's an explicit statement in the white paper produced by the House Commerce Committee that says, given this small percentage, this really isn't worth us worrying about, and we can get there by dealing with other sectors instead, right? Now, how did they get there? Right? They got there by assuming that all of the personal transportation over which you have substantial direct control is in the transportation sector. And all of the electricity use and other energy use in your home that doesn't cause emissions literally out of the home is in the electric generation sector. Right? And so what happens if you actually correct for that? Because once you make those assumptions, right, now you've decided that what we have to do is regulate industrial sectors because you've put the emissions in the industrial sectors in the first place. Now the question is, how do we regulate transportation? How do we regulate electricity generation? Because those are not matters of individual behavior. So we tried to flip that around and we tried to say, well, what if those are matters of individual behavior? And when you do that, then households are somewhere in the range of a third to, I think Paul has a paper that says about 40% of the U.S. carbon emissions. Right? And now all of a sudden two phenomena emerge from my perspective. One is individual behavior matters, households matter. We need to put the kind of resources into this that we do to other sectors given the contribution, number one. And number two, maybe more importantly, now there are different remedies you might use. Right? Now we might think about trying to change decision-making related to transportation or decision-making related to household energy use and not just assume that the question is how do I regulate the utility or the automotive industry or something of that nature. And those new kinds of policy innovations, new kinds of targets might lead to more viable policies in the first place. I like your warning sign. That's a nice one. So that's an idea that we tried to emerge out of the paper is the idea that household behavior matters, and that leads us to new kinds of initiatives. Yeah. So, Jonathan,
actually, something I'd like to throw in before we move off of this is when we look at both of the wedges, not one or the other here in these pie charts, there's a lot of synergy that happens as you start thinking about how the focus on the industrial side of electricity generation relates to the behavioral focus on the household side. And there's been a lot of discussion in the energy policy community about if we just decarbonize the electricity supply, should we actually be looking at improving energy efficiency in home heating and cooling? Because if we move everybody over to electricity and it's all clean, maybe that's more important than weatherizing homes and so forth. But then people realize, wait, the more that at the household side people start being more efficient with the use of energy, then the easier it is to shift the electricity sector over to being more renewable. So there's real synergy between the 2 points of view if we start looking at it from a policy perspective.
So in short, that's the way we think about this, and we're going to hear more as we go through the day, I think, about other perspectives on what we were trying to accomplish with that initial piece. The idea here is we're 10 years later. We're also 10 years into, here at Vanderbilt, the Institute for Energy Environment. We have George Hornberger here as the director of that institute, and you'll hear from him a little bit later today as well. So we're at a really nice demarcation point to step back, to look a little bit and say, what did we get right? What did we get wrong with that analysis and with the institutional structures we have, and what can we do moving forward? So what we're going to try to do is to have essentially a bifurcated program on 2 days. And maybe, Jonathan, if you'll talk about what we're trying to do today, and I'll move over to tomorrow more.
Yes, so today we're looking at, in our original behavioral wedge paper, we had our twofold analysis framework where we start with analyzing the technical potential of emission reductions if everyone does an act, and then we look at the behavioral plasticity to analyze, so what fraction of people who could take the action actually would with appropriate incentives and programs to make it convenient. And then today's going to focus on what's changed in the last 10 years, where are the new questions, and what do we know about technical potential and behavioral plasticity. And then we're bringing in a third thing that we introduced later, which is initiative feasibility, which is not just how would people respond to an incentive if it's there, that's the behavioral part, but is there an actor, whether it's a government or a private organization, that will put the measures in place to encourage and make it easier to take the action. So how does who's going to provide the initiatives that engage the behavioral plasticity?
Right, and then what we hope is to turn on the second day from focusing just on households to expanding the
For the live stream, remember the mic.
Thank you. Yeah. I got to follow my own advice here. So we're going to try to turn from just focusing on households on the first day to focusing more broadly on non-governmental targets and non-governmental actors. And we think about what we're going to do is Jonathan and I are going to show some slides suggesting that we think there's an opportunity here for a private sector wedge. And what do we mean by that? That would mean that we would get 1 billion tons a year of additional emissions reductions each year between now and 2030 that would be driven by, and the target both would be the private sector. And by that I mean broadly corporations, private universities, hospitals, religious organizations, etc. And the thought is not that we shouldn't have government action, but that if we're realistic, we should account for the idea that government action is unlikely to do as much as we might need anyway. So the idea is we're trying to buy time and supplement what government might otherwise do, and to think about whether or not there is an opportunity here for an interdisciplinary effort where we might have teams of people that each look at different sectors and cross-cutting issues and produce some kind of useful product that could drive funders, NGOs, corporate managers, and other institutional managers along the way. And we want to take a look at how might that happen. Where would the funding come from? Is there enough interest in the teams? Is there an opportunity, or has this already been done on some level? How could that all come together? And I think we just have the best team I can imagine in the world, frankly, in the room here, and people who will participate by video as well. So let's really quickly just walk through what we're going to try to do in terms of the panels. We want everyone to do very short presentations. We're going to be vigorous in trying to cut people off if we need to. This is not designed to be a one-way communication. We've got a terrific audience, and we have people, again, on live stream as well. And what we want to do is make sure that we provoke ideas and try to get as much as we can out of this. And I'm going to be sitting here taking really detailed notes, and we really want to act on what happens over the next 2 days. First panel, Jonathan, you're going to moderate that panel, and just quickly, what have we got?
Yes, so we have, this is going to be focusing on what is coming up in terms of technical potential and the ability to assess technical potential to reduce emissions. We're going to have Shazeen Attari from Indiana University, Leslie Herman from E3 Innovate, a local company that works on the ground at improving home energy efficiency, Jack Barkenbus from the Vanderbilt Institute of Energy and Environment talking about the potential for electric vehicles, and then Qianfei Chen from University of Tennessee talking about connecting residential energy consumption to issues of distribution and different populations.
Great. And then we're going to turn over, and Janet is going to moderate a panel for us, and we're going to look at the behavioral plasticity. So we move from thinking about technical potential for the most part to moving to behavioral plasticity, and what is the behavioral plasticity and the state of knowledge out there. We've got a great panel. I won't go through all of them, but we have a great panel, a number of former postdocs here, and Janet, of course, is in a wonderful position to talk about this, given the leadership role she's played in the psychology community over time. We're then going to break for lunch, and George Hornberger then is going to introduce Tom Dietz, and Tom's going to give us a talk. I've given a preliminary title there. Tom, you may decide to change that over time, but essentially to help us think on a more broad level about interdisciplinary research in this area. Okay, then we move in the afternoon to Paul Stern, who again has played a leading role. When I first started working in this area, I started reading every piece of psychological and sociological literature I could because I thought the legal literature was just inadequate on this. And I kept coming across the name of Stern and Dietz, and I called Paul Stern and I said, I'm trying to drive household and personal behavior in the legal area even without government commands. You know, what can we do to think about that? You seem to know a lot about that. And he said, you know, I feel like Rip Van Winkle, you know, that I worked on all this stuff 20, 30 years ago with Tom Dietz, and people just didn't think about it for all this time. And I think we've had somewhat of a revival in this area, but it's in part due, I think, to some of the early work that some of the people in the room here did. And so Paul's going to moderate this panel. I'm not going to try to describe all of it, but we're going to try to move here from direct effects of interventions to indirect effects, consumer behavior, lifestyle, et cetera, and Paul will give us a much more nuanced understanding. And this panel is going to include both thinking about technical potential and thinking about behavioral plasticity as well, but about indirect effects, which can be as important or more so in some cases than direct effects. And then I'm going to wrap up the day with a panel that I'm really excited about here to talk about initiative feasibility. What does that mean? How do we account for it? How do lawyers think about it? How do economists think about it? How do political scientists think about it? Are there ways to be systematic enough that we can better account for the likelihood of development, adoption, and implementation of policy than we now do when we're thinking about various kinds of interventions? So we are trying. One of the people we have on our panel next is Shazina Tari, and she did a paper that, Jonathan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially I think says that people don't even listen to climate scientists' science or give it credit if they think they fly a lot. Right? In other words, people have a little bit of a hypocrisy meter, and if that meter goes off, they'll even discount the underlying science, not just their policy conclusions. Fair enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to mention that paper came out a number of years ago, but it's being very current right now. Anyone who's following energy and climate Twitter, Shazine's paper is being very actively discussed as people talk about, should we simply wait for policy to reduce flying and meat consumption by everybody, or is it important for individuals, particularly prominent individuals in the advocacy for climate policy, to start personally reducing their flying, reducing their meat consumption for credibility? So this work remains absolutely current and at the focus of a lot of discussion.
And so what we've tried to do here is to take a number of steps. We've tried to affect the food that's being selected and served in ways that will reduce its footprint to the extent it can. We've tried to make sure that we encourage video presentations and are accommodating for that as much as we can be. Aviation accounts for 2 or 3% of global emissions. And we've gone out then and gotten Vanderbilt to agree to let us use some of our budget to buy offsets to, as much as we can, account for the emissions that we couldn't reduce. It's not a perfect solution, but it's our effort to send a message that we hope this is a more general phenomenon that will occur at academic conferences as much as possible. So with that, let me just thank really quickly Ray Mead Torres. I think Ray is not in the room for a moment. And also thank Jake, who has been tremendous in helping us with the IT. It's not easy when we do these intermingled panels of video and non-video, and Jake is an expert, and I've worked with him before in these events, so if we have any issues, I know we've got super help, but I very much appreciate that. Thank you to all of you all for coming here. Again, let's have a really interactive program, and we'll get started in just a second.
Yeah, and then another person, I want to thank David Knorr over here, a master's student in Earth and Environmental Sciences who's taking detailed notes, and we're going to try to work with that to synthesize reflections after this event is over.
Good. Okay, so with that, let's get the panelists for our first panel to come down, and we'll move from there. Yeah, good.